Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the podcast. I'm your host, Brian Keane, online fitness coach, nutritionist, and three-time best-selling author. Normally here to help you by deconstructing expert guests on all things health, fitness, and mindset. But today's episode is a solo recap of a recent race that I did, and it's a bonus episode. Also, it's going to be raw, unedited, so there's no intro, no outro, nothing like that. I'm just recording it straight into the microphone, but hopefully that it helps and supports you. I wasn't originally planning to do a recap podcast for the 2023 Gaelforce West Adventure Race that I completed at the weekend, but I put up a poll on Instagram, got an overwhelming amount of votes, an overwhelming amount of yes votes that made me think, okay, I'll do a recap here, partly for selfish reasons. I do plan to do this race again, and I would like to listen to this episode again to see what worked well, a reminder for what worked well for me and what I need to improve on. But also, if you are into adventure racing or looking to expand into that world, or you're looking to particularly do the Gaelforce event itself in the west of Ireland, then this might be a nice little episode that you can save and refer back to, because some of the things I'm going to talk about in today's podcast will be my training in the lead up to it, my nutrition in the lead up to it, my race week nutrition, my race week training, and a lot of overlap with how I tend to prepare for races in general. Sometimes I cover that on the podcast. Sometimes I don't, just because I tend to keep it a little bit more body composition, because it's what I specialize in terms of people that I work with. But endurance events, adventure races are things that I do from a personal level for a whole host of reasons, some of which we'll get into in today's podcast. So as I mentioned, this is an episode for anyone looking to potentially do the event in the future or any similar adventure race. So the first thing, the Gaelforce West Adventure Race, the breakdown of the event is road running, kayaking, trail running, cycling, a run or a hike up Croagh Patrick, and then a cycle. So in terms of how it's broken down, it's 60 kilometers overall. There's a 13.5 kilometer run to start, then a 1 to 2 kilometer kayak, then a 4 kilometer trail run, and then you go onto your bike for 30 kilometers. Then you go up Croagh Patrick, which is 700 meters, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of the height and elevation, and then you run down, hike down, etc., and then you finish with a 13 kilometer cycle. So the whole event took me just under 5 hours. Some things went very well for me, some things didn't go very well, and I'm hoping to learn even from myself for future events. This also worked as a little bit of a trial run for me. I have a big race in Kyrgyzstan beside China in the middle of July. So I'm running 200 kilometers over 5 days up the Tian Shian mountains in mountain range in Kyrgyzstan. I think that's 7,000 feet of elevation, so very high if I'm not mistaken. I think Everest is 8.5 and then this is 7, so it's pretty high and working towards heavy altitude. I'm doing that to raise money for cancer research. I'll put that link in the description below as well for anyone that wants to donate. My dad had cancer last year. My godmother the same. So it's one of those things that a lot of people get hit by, either directly or indirectly. So I wanted to bring a little bit of awareness, obviously, around that, raise a little bit of money for it. So that link will be below as well. But I have that race in a month, and Gaelforce was something that gave me a nice little trial for how I wanted to apply what I think will be my nutritional strategy in Kyrgyzstan beside China in a month's time. So before I get into the nutrition in the lead up to it, I'll talk a little bit about the training in the lead up, because that won't take up as much time. Most of my training for the past 3 months has been a combination of runs, distance runs, speed runs, and a lot of work on stairmasters or climbing mountains, partly to condition myself to be ready for the 200 kilometer run in Kyrgyzstan. But also it was doubling over for Gaelforce. The only difference was in the last 6 weeks, I added in more bike work. So a lot of bike sprints in the gym or outdoor bike work. And those training sessions varied greatly depending on the day, depending on the week. The mileage that I built up was as long as 30 kilometers in a single run. And I would try and do those fasted. I would try and do those early in the morning after doing a weight session, so that I was already fatigued, to condition my body to work with very little nutrients in my system, or very little food or calories in my system. so that I could become a little bit more fat adapted, something I'll come on to when I focus on the nutrition side. And my short runs could be all the way down from 6 to 11k for speed. And then Stairmaster, 20, 30, 40, 50 minutes on the Stairmaster to mimic what would have been preparing for Croagh Patrick. So I would do sessions, and Monday would always be my long run. So normally a 15, 20, 25 or 30 kilometer run. Tuesday was a combination Gaelforce style session. So it was normally some form of circuit with a bike, sprints, normally on a bike, 30 seconds of sprint, 30-second recovery, 10, 15 or 20 times. Stairmaster with a high incline speed, normally around the level 13. So that I'm able to do 100 plus steps or 100 plus floors over a 10, 15, 20 minute period. And then there'd be a run in there as well, and a treadmill, and I would rotate between the three. So I would go bike for 20 minutes with sprints, I would go treadmill for 20 minutes, and I would go Stairmaster for 20 minutes. And sometimes I would alternate and change up the rounds in which I was doing it. If the gym was quiet, I would do 10 minutes on each, and I would go faster and harder because I was able to change up what muscle groups are being used primarily during a session. So if I was on the bike and I was upright, it'd feel more quad dominant. If I was on the Stairmaster, it's more glute dominant and feeling it through my calves. So I'd rotate those training sessions, and they put me in really good stead for Gaelforce. Something that people struggle with, and this is a lot of my friends or people I've had on the podcast who have done adventure races or triathlons in the past, will normally talk about jelly legs, where you go from running or cycling to try and hike or run, and your legs just completely give way underneath. So I would do those brick sessions where I would do running followed by cycling, and in this case followed by Stairmaster. So during Gaelforce, I didn't get that jelly leg at any point. There was no stage where my legs felt like they were going to go from underneath me, and I would chalk that up to quite a success. So that was the training for the most part in the lead up, particularly over the last 6 weeks. The nutrition in the lead up, and I will come into my entire race day strategy here, my nutrition in the lead up then was fat adaptation focus. Partly down to it works better for me in terms of my digestive issues. I've got a pretty sensitive stomach. I have a history of irritable bowel syndrome and IBS, so I have to be very careful with what I consume food-wise and how much food I consume on a race, because I can't fuel like a normal carbohydrate-based athlete. My digestive system just isn't strong enough for that. My constitution isn't strong enough for that. So if I'm able to fat adapt, it means I can go. And fat adaptation, for anyone unfamiliar with that term, just means that you run primarily off fat, either dietary fat or stored body fat, partly ketosis in and out of it, but you're not relying on carbohydrate or food for fuel. Your body's able to keep ticking over itself even if there's an absence of food. Hence why I train fasted in the mornings, to try and improve that fat adaptation. And I was doing that in the lead up, partly because when I go to China, it serves me better, similar to when I ran through the Sahara and I ran through the Arctic, and even my first 100-mile ultramarathon. It serves me better to be able to tap into fat stores because I don't have to eat as much food and I don't get the digestive distress that can come with that. I tried to change that strategy for that 100-miler in Nevada in 2020, and it ended up losing about 20 minutes from having to go to the toilet and just sit there for a while. So again, TMI, I know, but any ultra runner or adventure race athlete will understand this, or even marathon runners, where you can get that digestive distress from some of the gels, etc. I largely avoid that, something I'll come into when I talk about the race day nutrition. So that lead up and that nutrition was primarily fat based, meaning that most of my foods are coming from either meat or fish, vegetables and fat sources, with a little bit of carbohydrate thrown in between, mostly from either rice or oats, and keeping it very simple, very plain, nothing too crazy with the nutrition. So now we'll get into race day. Gaelforce, in terms of the layout, I was in wave 1, so the first wave. You need to be at the start line for 7:30 in the morning, and the call for the bus that you need to get on, and the bus basically brings you to your start line, and the race pack says if you miss your bus, you miss your race. So you need to be in Westport in Mayo in the west of Ireland for 6 a.m. for the bus to pick you up. So I was up at 4:30. I went to bed the night before at 8:30 to try and get a decent sleep. I never sleep that well before races or events. I can't switch off the pre-fight nerves or pre-race nerves for the 2 days before an event. Like, I always get a little bit of a mini IBS flare up before I do a race. There's no way around it for me. And it doesn't matter how many of these I do, whether it's a marathon or an adventure race or an ultra marathon, my body always feels that stress and those nerves. And I can't and still haven't figured a solution. If I ever do, I'll share it on the podcast. But it's just powering through it, knowing that there are pre-fight nerves. They'll go away once the bell goes or the whistle goes and you start the race, and you learn to cope with that much better the more of these you do. But I was up at 4:30, went to bed at 8:30, and then dialed in my nutrition from my first meal from 5:30 a.m. So at 5:30 a.m., an hour after waking, I had 60 grams of oats. I had a scoop of Sun Warrior rice protein, which is the protein powder I use, and 1 scoop of MCT oil. And I added 50 grams of keto granola. I think ActiSport is the name of the brand for the keto granola. I've only started using this recently. And this was part of my pre-race nutrition that I plan to use in Kyrgyzstan beside China in July as well. So I wanted to test how that would work. And that higher fat, moderate carb, moderate protein meant that I felt very fueled. I wasn't hungry. I didn't have any issues with energy at any point for the first couple of hours. So the race kicked off. We got our bus from Westport at 6 a.m. driving to Loch Ina, which is where the race begins, which is funnily about 30 minutes from my house. I actually went to Westport to come back to Loch Ina. Like, would have been faster to just drive there and do the race, but you have to get on the bus because I live quite locally to that. And 7:30, the bell goes or the whistle goes and the race began. So it started with 13.5 kilometer run through a combination of trail, bog, road in a field. You're in this beautiful part of the west of Ireland where you just have sheep on one side, in both sides, and mountains in between. And 13.5 kilometers at that point for me felt very easy. I had a good pace. I've been doing a lot of this training. I had no struggle with that distance. I went straight through. If you haven't been doing 10 kilometer runs or 15 kilometer runs continuously, you're going to find this a little bit tricky just because you're climbing over fences in parts, you're going uphill in parts, and it can be a little bit tricky. But that 13.5 kilometers for me was no problem. I'd recommend, if you're doing Gaelforce, that you at least do 1 or 2 15-kilometer straight runs just to condition your body to that distance so that you're not feeling fatigued. After that, then we came down by Killary Ford, which is again on the west coast, as far west as you can go, and there's a kayak which is either 1 to 2 kilometers. The website said 1 kilometers and the race pack said 2 kilometers, so I think between 1 and 2 kilometers. It's a double kayak, meaning that, or I don't know what you call it, but there's a 2-person kayak. So whoever you're closest to in the race, you hop in the kayak with them. I had a girl, Ashleen, behind me, and we 2 of us hopped in. We're having a nice little chat going across the kayak, going across the ford, and you're kayaking from one side to the other. Now, this is something I'd never done. I haven't kayaked, I think, since I was 7 or 8, but I do have a stand-up paddleboard, and myself and my missus regularly go out paddleboarding, and sometimes when we're sitting down, we're just paddling left and right, and it's nearly an identical movement. So I found that part very easy. It's all upper body. You get a little bit of a rest on the legs. The only downside was I could feel my legs, because you're in a straight position with your feet, they were cramping up slightly in the kayak. But upper body, if you have a strong upper body, you're not going to have any issue with this. There's a workout that I've posted to my Instagram a few times where you put yourself upright on a bench, you grab a barbell, and then you twist it in a rowing motion. I normally like it for abs in terms of a core-based movement. It's something I used to do when I competed in bodybuilding shows, but it crosses over nicely to kayak. I think I would do more of that in a prep for another race that had a kayak, just to go a bit faster, because it's a technique, but you also have to be strong upper body to be able to pull the water to go through speed. After that kayak then, you get your life jacket on one side, you hop in the kayak, you go across the ford, you then take off your life jacket, and then you go up this kind of bog / field that is joined up at the ford or joined up at the Killary Harbour. and you're there for about 2 kilometers going straight up. You can run this. It's just quite technical. You make sure you don't trip on any rushes, or making sure you don't trip on anything that's on the floor in terms of the field and the stones and the rocks. And then you come back onto a bog road for another 2 kilometers or so. And then that joins in by Delphi Adventure Centre, which is an adventure centre where you can go paddleboarding, kayaking, doing a whole host of adventure sports on the west coast of Ireland. And you run past that adventure centre into where your bike is. Now, at this point in the race, I was feeling really confident. My speed was good on the run. My kayak time was fine. My trail run up the bog was good. And then the bike came. And this is where I had a massive wake up call, because I'm quite strong on a bike. One of the advantages of being a bigger athlete, and there's definitely disadvantages to this in terms of being 85 kilograms, 5'8", quite stocky and well built. One of the upsides of that is I'm very strong on hills on a bike. I have very big legs, I have very thick and chunky legs, so I'm quite good on a bike. But I joked on Instagram stories the day before that one of the advantages of having a kind of crappy bike, my bike was about €200, about £200. I bought it when I was in London working as a teacher, is that nobody ever wants to nick it. And a side story to why I have such a crappy bike. When I was working full-time as a teacher, and I'll digress for a second because this will give you context to why would you do an adventure race with a crappy bike. I was working in 2012 as a teacher in London, and I wasn't earning a lot of money, about 20,000 a year, 21,000 a year, which isn't a lot when you're living in central London. And I had very little money left over at the end of the month. And it took me, I think, 2 or 3 months to save for a new bike. And I went and bought a racer for about £700. Now, it took me 2-3 months, maybe longer, to save for it. I was putting away money, squirreling away money. I was doing personal training sessions, and I was putting all that money aside so that I could get myself a good bike. And 2 days after buying this bike, a lovely white racer, one of my friends that was living with me at the time took it down to the shop to Sainsbury's, locked it up outside, came out, and the bike was nicked. And that time I thought I was going to cry, because it was all the money in the world to me at the time. £700 may as well have been 70,000 to me back then. And I was like, I can't afford a new bike. What am I going to do? It actually took me another month just to save up for another £200-300 bike that I used for this adventure race that I got 10 years ago. And I vowed never to spend money on an expensive bike again, or not buy nice things, because people nick nice things. And it probably planted a seed for that frugality that I still have to this day. But I was gutted, absolutely heartbroken at the time. Again, such first world problem. Someone stole my new bike. But I remember thinking, I'm not going to be able to afford a bike like that again. Like, there's no chance. And the bike I use, some Ridgeback kind of mountain bike that kind of squeaks as you go along. I thought, okay, 30 kilometers on this bike. I regularly do 30 kilometers to prepare and fatigue my leg before runs when training for ultramarathons. This would be perfectly fine. But this is where your comparison to other people comes in, because there was 2 occasions, and I say 15, if not 20 people passed me out on the bike, because I was going 2 occasions, hell for leather, as fast as I could, upright in a sprint position on the bike. And twice, 2 people sitting down on their road racers going half my speed just came by and passed me out. And I thought, oh my God, my bike is crap. It's not for this. This is definitely not the race that it's for. Now, again, it's not an excuse. It's more of a learning moment for if you're doing these types of races. You probably need the equipment. I've been a long-term subscriber that you don't need to worry too much about your equipment. Just get your body in shape. But when it comes to something like a bike on a cycle race, you do, and it does play a massive role. As I said, twice that happened. I had one girl who I really enjoyed speaking to. Karen was her name, same name as my sister, and she was looking at my bike as we were going side by side, and she was passing me and we were having a chat, and she was like, you need a new bike badly. And I thought, you're right, 100%. And she then took up off a mountain without even getting up into the upright position, and I had to switch into bottom gear and get up on my bike to try and get it to the top of the mountain. And that is something that going forward, for sure, next time I do a race similar to this, either Gaelforce or an alternative adventure race, I'll go with another bike, a racer or something that's a better fit. I put this up on my Instagram as well. Bikes aren't a strong suit for me. I know nothing about them. So I did put up a post about anyone who has knowledge or interest in bikes to comment on that Gaelforce post. And I've been using some of those recommendations to follow up in terms of what to potentially look for, where to potentially go for it. So that cycle, 30K, wasn't a struggle in the sense that I wasn't fatigued or tired. I felt really good. I was just slow. And that brought me up to the bottom of Croagh Patrick. And Croagh Patrick, for anyone unfamiliar with it, is a pretty tall mountain, one of the tallest ones in the west of Ireland. I think it's 700 meters. And by the time you get to the bottom of Croagh Patrick, you've done 13.5 kilometers road running. You've gone 2 kilometers or so in a kayak. You've ran trail for 4K and you've cycled 30K. So your legs are pretty tired and pretty fatigued at this point. Right before I got on the bike, I went with about 50 grams of almond butter in terms of my food. My entire race nutrition was down to keeping that high fat. So right before I hopped on the bike, 2 hours or so into the race, an hour 45 or so into the race, I fueled up with about 50 grams of almond butter. I then did this 30K on the bike. And at the end of the bike, I took another 30 to 40 grams of almond butter. And again, it worked really well for me. It's a little bit tricky to carry. There used to be sachets of this that you could buy in any health store, but now I just put it into a little tub and I use a spoon to eat it. And it works well for me. It doesn't impact my digestion or anything along those lines. I would say the thing that went the best on this race for me was my nutrition. Was the first time in a race ever I got it 100% right. And that's never happened in marathon preps, in ultra marathons, in multi-day stage races. I've never got my nutrition 100% right. Something's always impacted me negatively. I spoke about Clonakilty Marathon last year on social media, or was it last year, 2021, that I tried a new electrolyte drink and it ruined my stomach about 2 hours into the marathon. And I had to walk sections of the marathon. My stomach was cramping so badly. And I vowed for this one to not go with any electrolyte drink and just leave it and just see how my body is without it. I think I'll still go with probably salt tablets for Kyrgyzstan in July. But I did go with a version of my pre-workout drink on the bike, which is 3 grams of beta-alanine, 3 grams of citrulline malate, 1.5 grams of L-carnitine or acetyl L-carnitine, and 3 grams of AAKG, which is a form of arginine. And that worked quite well. It was what I take before I work out and train. I don't use pre-workouts because, again, down to a sensitive stomach, I can't really handle them. So I tend to make my own. And I had that on the bike waiting for me. I took my almond butter. I drank and sipped on this drink for the 30-kilometer cycle. I then went for another portion of almond butter before climbing up Croagh Patrick, and then that was a hike. So the plan was to hike it as fast as I could, and I'd made decent speed going up. There's no way to make Croagh Patrick easy, even if you're 100% fresh. And I went up a few times for training hikes. Even at your freshest, it's still a difficult climb, particularly at the top, because of the grip. And although it's been recently stoned and there's a bit more of what looks and feels a little bit more like a footpath with rocks, it's still a difficult climb. So I went up there. You get to the very top of Croagh Patrick. You round the church that's at the very top of Croagh Patrick. I then took a fulfill bar on board. So I ate a fulfill bar, a white chocolate cookie dough fill bar, and I flew down Croagh Patrick. I felt a second wind, a heavy second wind at that point. And I've been doing a lot of runs and decline runs to prepare for China next month. So as I came down Croagh Patrick, my body felt very strong. Now, it's technical when you're running down Croagh Patrick. You need to do a combination of finding the right route so that you don't slip. When there's so many rocks and pieces of wood and trees, you can trip over and fall very easily. So it's quite technical. So my head was down the whole way until I got near the bottom, where it then turns into bog and you're able to run it at speed. So got up Croagh Patrick, had the fulfill bar, ran down, and then hopped on the bike, which was a 13-kilometer cycle into Westport. And I was able to make decent time on this at that point. 13 kilometers, less than half than the 30K, and I just pelted it. I went as fast as I could back into Westport. Now, there was a downpour of rain at this point because the weather held decently well up until that point. It wasn't that sunny, a a bit overcast, and there was a downpour, which was actually a nice little respite because I'd been sweating coming down the mountain. And then came into Westport. You then park up your bike and then you run to the finish line. The whole thing took me 4 hours and 58 minutes. And I was quite content with that. I think I probably, with a better bike, would have knocked another half an hour off that, maybe 40 minutes off that. And I would love to do this race again. One of the big take homes for me, and this was my first technically adventure race. I've done a lot of ultra marathons and different events in the past. This was very enjoyable. And I wouldn't say it's on the same level as an ultra marathon in terms of the achievement when you hit the end. For me personally, this is so relative to the person, but it was definitely way more enjoyable, meaning that I would happily sign up and do this race again and happily do it every single year as a focus point for training, because it just has enough of a breakdown that you have to do a bit of running in your training, you have to do a bit of biking in your training, you have to do a bit of hiking in your training, but that combination and rotating between them means that you come in quite recovered because you're not running all the time. When I'm preparing for an ultra marathon, it's just running. I do my strength work as well, but it's just running, and your knees take a pounding from that, and your ankles take a pounding from that repetitive strain, and it gets a little bit boring. Whereas I really enjoyed the last few weeks of preparation for this in terms of training, in terms of focus for training, because it was mixed up nicely. And I really enjoyed the race. I thought it was very well run, really happy with how it was organized. I thought the people that were doing the event, the people that organized it, were fantastic. I was talking to a few at the finish line. I was talking to people on the race during periods before and after. And these type of events bring a very specific type of person. I think outside of probably 30 people who are going to come first, second, and third and win these races, everybody else, I would say, for the most part, is there for their own personal reasons, either to complete it and get that sense of self-satisfaction, or to have something to train for, which is for me, otherwise I get bored at my training, or someone who just wants to challenge themselves and do something that's a bit different, or even network with the people around. You tend to meet very cool people at these events. I met several on the race. I was sitting beside a guy, Niall, from Dublin beforehand, and having a great chat back and forth. He had a similar GA background to me and had moved into these adventure races. And you end up finding people who are there for their personal reasons. One of the things I loved about playing sport, GA soccer, was it's very competitive, and that works well for kind of fueling that inner desire of, all right, I need to be better. I need to be better for my team, us versus them. And I loved that for large portions of my life. With adventure racing and ultra marathons in particular, you have that competitiveness, but it tends to be very internal and with yourself. Most people there are there to compete against themselves. And if I go back and do this race again, it would be to beat my time. And that element gives you a completely different focus, because you have people there who are cheering on encouragement, who might be ahead of you, who might be behind you, and you're doing the same to them. And that's something that is a great boost when you're doing these races, because you see this camaraderie with other people who are just there for their own reasons, as opposed to trying to beat you. They're not. They're trying to beat themselves or their time or their internal demons or their own limitations in terms of what they can and can't do. And it's very inspiring and it's very motivating to see that with people. And when it comes to these styles of races, I think if you are interested in doing it, if you are considering it, they're very achievable with the right training plan going into it. And I think that if you have any sort of base level of fitness, either in running or cycling, particularly those two disciplines, you'd be able to do this. It's not a out of this world challenge. It's a very doable challenge with a structured plan. I would say things like Marathon des Sables, running through the Arctic, even a 100-mile ultra marathon, they're a little bit trickier to recommend to people because they're life-changing, but they're expensive in terms of financial commitment, expensive in terms of time commitment, and realistically, not everybody can do them, because you need to be very mentally and internally strong. You need to be physically very well trained, and you need to make sure that those two things are right coming into the race day because they're stage races and multi-day races. Something like Gaelforce West is a really good challenge for the average fitness person, or slightly above average fitness person. I wouldn't go from couch to 5k to Gaelforce. I would do some form of 10k or half marathon first and then build up. But I think if you're looking for something that's going to give you a little bit of focus, or you're experimenting or thinking about experimenting with adventure style races, I think this is a really good starting point for people. It's in a beautiful part of the country. I'm super biased because I'm relatively local to where the race is, but great people doing it, really well organized. Hopefully this podcast gives you some ideas in terms of what it looks like. If there's that fear or anxiety around, will I do it? What does it look like? Which again, a lot of fear comes from a lack of data. So hopefully this podcast reduces that element at least. And now it's just doing the things that are within your control the controllables. What's your nutrition looking like 6-12 weeks before? What's your training looking like 6-12 weeks before? And some of the mistakes I made. As I mentioned, the things that went well, my timings for runs were really good, nearly spot on to what I thought they'd be prior. My cycle was way off by about 30 or 40 minutes. I was considerably slower than I thought I'd be on the bike. And things like Croagh Patrick and the Kayak were a little bit of an uncertainty. Both went perfectly fine for me. And I know others that did the race probably had similar experiences, others with completely different experiences, but that was my recap from start to finish of the 2023 Gaelforce West Adventure Race and the recap. So hopefully it helped. Let me know. Hit me up on Instagram if you want to plan, or if you are planning to do this race in the future. Maybe save it or send it to any friends or family members who are thinking about doing it, and hopefully it helps you, it helps them. And if you do end up doing the race, let me know how you got on. That's everything from me from today's bonus podcast. Thank you so much for listening all the way through. If you did enjoy it, be sure to leave a rating and a review, and if it's your first time listening, be sure to hit that follow and subscribe button for new episodes coming every single Monday. Catch you all next week.